how we started was great. So, it's like if we can maybe just a little bit touch back on that. So like how did the so can you explain the continent allegories project? How did the idea of the project come about?
Well, I think the main instigator was Marion Romberg, who was a PhD student at the time at the University of Vienna. So the project started in 2012, and it was a research project financed by the Austrian Science Fund. So that's the premier Austrian research funding agency for every research, no matter whether it's humanities or natural sciences or whatever. And she got in touch with Wolfgang Schmale, a professor at the University of Vienna, historian. And he has done a lot of work on the history of Europe, on the history of ideas and concepts of Europe. And this also included, of course, the iconography of Europe. And from there, it was just a short step to the iconography of all four continents. And so these two got together and did a project application that was successful. And Wolfgang Schmale was the project lead, and Marion Romberg was a PhD researcher. And I was sort of drafted later into the project. I think I was there from 2013, 2015. I had finished my PhD, and I had done a lot of work on colonial history, of North American colonial history. But I've also worked with Wolfgang Schmale in a preceding project on ideas of Europe in the 17th century. And yeah, I was looking for a job and I got drafted in. And this was really fascinating for me. And I guess I started like many of the people you mentioned who were blown away by these paintings, you said.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And from the questions we discussed, I've seen that many are kind of interested to know what were the informations these artists had. And these were also the questions I came with when I started with this project. I thought, I could maybe find out something about this transfer of knowledge from the new world to the old world, and maybe understand better how Central Europe, which we're talking about the region that's not close to the Atlantic seaboard. That's seaboard. So like the British or Spain or whatever, the Dutch. And yeah, I thought this would be very fascinating, but answers turned out differently than I expected. And I guess we are going to touch upon that later on in
More of
our
that today.
discussion.
And so, like, how do you guys find out about the images? Are those known out there, like those paintings,
Yeah.
like the allegory, the four continents, or was that something you had to kind of stumble upon?
Also Marion Romberg is an art historian, and of course she became interested in this motif, in this sujet, before she came to Wolfgang Schmale with the idea of doing a research project. And the thing is that these allegories of the four continents, they crop up basically, after Europeans discover or rediscover the Americas, and then there are the first travel reports, especially the Columbus letters, the letters by Amerigo Vespucci, and so on. And then, of course, Spain starts to conquer these huge territories. And this doesn't really immediately reach the German-speaking Central European regions. But suddenly in the 18th century, this explodes, and these allegories of the four continents become very common, especially in southern German village churches. And the question was, why? This is not logical, right? America was not on the forefront of the minds of peasants in a Bavarian village. They had other problems and interests. So this is how this was the basic question that the project wanted to answer. And I mean, how did they know that there are so many continent allegories in, for example, village churches? And sometimes these are really places that are way out. So you wouldn't just stop there and walk into the church. It's small places, right? Well, there is a lot of, for Germany and Austria, and also, of course, northern Italy, what's South Tyrol today, Alto Adige. There's a lot of literature. There's a lot of handbooks. There's a lot of guides, art history guides, you know, for kind of the educated tourists, but also for students of art history. And there you would have, like, for every village, you would have a short entrance telling you, okay, there's the village of St. Stephen, and there would be a very, very short, concise overview of what's in there. Sometimes that's better, sometimes it's not so good, but still, you have an idea. And we basically started by going through all this sort of handbook literature and making a list of places we need to visit. And then there's already an interesting, or there was already an important monograph by a scholar from the Netherlands, Sabine Pöschl, who had written on continent allegories, and there were some articles and so on. Basically, we went from there. But I mean, we have more than 400 instances of continent allegories in our database.
Yeah,
so
crazy.
you can't just go out there, look for something.
Yeah, I know, because when I'm looking, I'm going through the website, I am in awe. Like, I'm so glad you guys kind of took the time to go around, and especially Marion, you know, I'm so appreciated for her. How long did the process take? Say, how many photographers did it take to?
Yeah, well, basically it was Marion Romberg, who had already taken a lot of pictures before, visited a lot of places and taking pictures of the whole decoration of these places before the project started. And then she continued visiting places in Bavaria and Swabia, also southern Germany, more or less. And I did the same for Austria, especially Western Austria and Northern Italy, South Tyrol. So I was really driving for weeks around Austria, Northern Italy, visiting small villages, trying to find someone who would unlock the door of the church for me and turn on the lights, maybe, or turn off the alarm.
And that kind of goes into my next question, because it says, because I was asked, did the churches help provide any of the information?
Yeah.
Or
yeah, well, so I mean, we were basically taking the pictures. There were also some colleagues who were visiting places in the Czech Republic and taking pictures for us there. And others also provided information or visual material they already had. But basically, it was Marion and me.
no.
And Marion really did the lion's share of
Yeah,
this work.
it
Yeah,
was totally great, awesome.
Yeah, did they help? Well, of course, if you're talking about village churches, or maybe a small chapel somewhere in a village, then the locals and also the priests or the secretariats there, usually they cannot provide a lot of help. Of course, some are interested, they're more historically minded, or they had some time to research this, and then they usually would happily share this information. I already mentioned that we also have visited big monasteries. So Austria and Germany, especially the Catholic parts, of course, are full of really huge monasteries, abbeys that were built in the Baroque era, very rich places.
Yeah,
And
huge.
yeah, and really, even nowadays, these are sometimes rich institutions. You know, they have forestries, they're agrarian enterprises, and so on. And maybe they are also running retreats or hotels and so on. And also they kind of have museums or collections they are showing. So it's really places tourists visit. Some of them are famous, like Andex in Bavaria or Melk near Vienna in Lower Austria. So ships from the Danube ships would stop and American tourists walk up and visit the monastery. And there, of course, they have their own public relations departments. They have departments that are running the museum and the collection. They have their own libraries, and they can be usually they are very helpful, and they can also point us to literature and so on. And they are sort of professional about it, and they also have the funding for this sort of thing. Of course, there are also orders or abbeys where there are only a few monks left, and there it's all sort of more small scale. It really depends on the place. But yeah, I think that usually those village priests and monasteries are happy when people show interest, when scholars show interest, when research happens. And then we have a smaller group of privately owned buildings. Like a family buys an old castle and renovates it. They live in there, and most of the time these are also kind of happy to provide information and also open their living rooms. Of course, this can be a bit challenging to take pictures.
Yeah.
Because
especially
people have
of someone's
books
houses,
or cupboards, yeah.
And that's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking during this interview, should I get into some of the images, or should we just direct people to the website and they can kind of like go through the website as we're talking? So I'm not really having to go through and wait for emails back.
Well, I mean, we could do this at least for some, but yeah. I think the main interest here is really how this phenomenon came about and why these allegories are looking the way they look, right? What kind of knowledge transfers, what kind of cultural transfers are there or are not there?
Do you think the paintings properly represent the nations who they are portraying? Like, if that makes sense?
Yeah. No, I mean, this was something I really was interested in. But the thing is that we're just how to start, maybe we should better start with, I mean, why this whole Baroque decorations came how this came about.
Totally
because
agree.
the continent allegories always, they're not the centerpieces, they always form part of a decoration. And for many reasons, in the 18th century, you see throughout this whole southern German-speaking region of the Holy Roman Empire, of the German nation, you see that there is a building boom, right? Not only the nobility that builds palaces and rich merchants that build townhouses in places like Vienna, also in rather small villages, or today small villages, they garner the funds to renovate their old, mostly medieval churches, or really just build new ones. And sometimes you stand there and you're just in awe how beautiful this is.
Yeah, they're amazing.
And they couldn't do this by themselves, of course. So they hired professional artists, professional builders, professional masons, architects, of course, and then the painters that made these frescoes. But we were also interested in sculptures. The ones who were kind of making these sculptures in plaster or wood or whatever, stone, marble, yeah. And these were really professional companies that were spending the summers painting palaces or churches or whatever with frescoes, they were doing the whole decoration. So this was really a lot of money was involved in these things. So this is also a time when, of course, the economic background is there to do these things. And you really have to understand these as spaces that are fully decorated. And it's not a collection of discrete images, it's always a program. You know, this is this early modern idea of creating a theatrum sacrum. This also has to do with the Counter-Reformation and the resurgence of Catholicism in these parts of the empire that were ruled by Catholic monarchs. And it's really designed for people to step in and to be overwhelmed. But it's also spaces that that are intended to be read. You know, you walk through as a transient observer, you look up and you see, okay, here's the adoration of Mary. And here are the 4 church fathers, and they are looking at her. And over there you have the 4 continents, you know, they representing the whole world united in the adoration of the Eucharist or the Virgin Mary. Yeah. Whatever. And so this is really
and it would be hard for you to actually do say they do portray them 100%. Like they do portray them, because there's so many different portrayals, and then even in Africa you have like, you know, European portrayals, and then you have like, you know, so it would be hard to say yes they do portray them accurately, you know. So
exactly, yeah, they're not interested in they're interested in seriality. They're interested in the main message. In village churches, this message is usually religious, of course, and they're not interested in kind of an ethnographic information. It's really very stereotypical, and it's always part of a seriality. So they say, okay, we need to have the 12 apostles. There we have a space for, you know, we have 4 corners, so we could do the 4 winds. We could also do the 4 continents, really depending on the central message we want to show. And this was a bit frustrating at first for me, because, you know, you cannot show the link between an 18th century portrayal of I don't know, a Shawnee war captain, or
was it Tecumseh or
a Cherokee, whatever, Cherokee chieftain, or just some scene that's produced by British colonial artists in early 18th century North America, and then for some reason via London arrives in Augsburg, and maybe a German artist sees it. That might happen, but it doesn't enter into these decoration programs. Instead, the interesting thing is something I had to learn. It's more obvious and more common knowledge among art historians, is that there is rather a very narrow pool of models artists used throughout the ages. And interestingly enough, these really go back to the 16th century, to the earliest information. You often see, for example, America as a man or a woman with a kind of feather crown and a skirt made of feathers, or sometimes it's leaves. And this really goes back to early prints, early German prints that were used to illustrate Amerigo Vespucci. And they just read what Vespucci was writing about the Tupinamba, and then somebody made a woodcut. And this gets reproduced endlessly and endlessly and endlessly. Of course, there are variations. So artists showed their craft, their artistry through cunning variations and combinations. But yeah, today you would say it's a matter of copy and paste.
Because I've heard I did research in my one book, and where it kind of goes into the Tupinamba in Brazil.
Yeah.
And I did see some of the paintings where they would do it was like where the Tupinamba was like with the Magi, I think that's how I pronounce it. But they had a lot of really historical images that had the Tupinamba in them.
Yeah.
So I did kind of go through those ones.
Yeah, well, there's this famous woodcut by Froschmeyer, what's his name? Johann Froschauer from 1505. And I think this is really the source of an important source for this iconographic program. So you can find it easily, I think even on Wikipedia, where you see that people are wearing feathers and they have bows and arrows. And of course, they are cannibals and all these
Yeah, you do see a lot of the
cliches
cannibal.
that go on and on and on and on forever. Yeah. And then, and what these artists were doing, because they were working very quickly, within a couple of weeks, they were producing these frescoes. But huge areas of these frescoes. And they had kind of collections of books bound with print. And these were their models. And they were just flipping through that and drawing that on the wall. And making sketches and then reproducing it on the wall. And we found one or two of these kind of model collections, Vorlagenbücher. And then you clearly see where this painting on the wall comes from. It's a contemporary print, and they just used it. And of course, they do variations, because you have to put a certain figure in this restricted place. And then maybe you don't have, your model isn't an America, but maybe it's a virtue of justice, and you change it a bit, it gets a feather crown. But yeah, you can see very clearly how they operated. And it has nothing to do with the newest information from the New World. And in the 18th century, information would have been available. All this information, all the Jesuit letters were translated into German and printed, and the scholars and educated people were interested in that, but it was not part of Baroque art.
Because I noticed some of them it kind of starts to die off, maybe like just before 1770, like mid 1760, 1770 area is where the dates of them kind of start to fall off, where they stop kind of putting those.
And so the first ones we have is the oldest we have is from 1581 in a small palace in South Tyrol. It was the residence of the bishop. And this is really part of the iconography that's already used in Italy by the nobility there, the rich merchants of Venice and so on. And of course, and then only in the 17th century, it crosses the Alps. And in the 18th century, this really takes off and becomes this huge phenomenon I've described, which has to do with this building boom. And of course, not in every church or in every palace you find the continent allegories. It's even larger, right? And then towards the end of the century, it sort of tapers off. And the last example we have is from 1858, again in South Tyrol, in a village church. But this is really an outlier, right? And I've always wondered why they did this. We know that this is a fresco that was paid for by a farmer, a local man, because his wife died, I think, and in her memory, he gave money to the church for a new painting on the wall. And was it an altarpiece? I've forgotten. I would have to look that up. But anyway, there's a story behind it, but it's really an outlier. Of course, you have the 4 continents in the 19th century as well, and later on also 5. It becomes a matter of, imperialist iconography. There's a huge statue in London, I think in Westminster, or Kensington Park, of Prince Albert, and he's surrounded by representatives of the 5 continents. But this changes. Then they really wanted to present an archetypical Plains Indian, and I think there's even a bison. So this is not Baroque art anymore. That's a whole new idea about the world. That's a whole new idea about empire and colonialism.
When it comes to the African and the American continent, they're both projected black skin, dark skin, and usually America is projected usually of more browner tone. How are you able to distinguish the difference between, because some of the images, they look identical?
Well, Sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's difficult, and sometimes it's impossible. And the easiest things is when they actually wrote the names below them. Yeah,
Yeah, because I've
that's
seen
there are
some of them.
instances
Yeah.
of that. Yeah. Then in in many cases, or in a majority of cases, it's easy because, as I said, this iconography is so stereotypical. And I forgot to mention that there's a famous handbook of iconology by Cesare Ripa, an Italian, was produced in the early, I think in 1590. And then there were iterations, so reprints throughout the 17th and 18th century. It was something artists also referred to. You know. In the first edition, it's just written. So America is a woman with a feather crown and a skirt of leaves and accompanied by an alligator or crocodile, and she has an arrow in her hand. And I think she carries a head of a slain enemy. So this is again cannibalism, of course, yeah. And then there in the next editions, you have already paintings. Also, you have artists also use this as a model. And sometimes they follow these models so closely that there's no doubt. You know, if you see feathers and bow and arrow and an alligator, which sometimes looks like a dog,
Yeah.
but still. And Africa, there's sometimes the sun, there's a lion, and so on.
And I've also noticed in the America, they also project lions sometimes in some of the
Yeah,
American ones. So that one
and then
really confused me.
and then you said as a skin colors.
Yes.
I mean, Germans at the time had this idea of the Moor, dark-skinned, or what they perceived as dark-skinned person, or the black. That this wasn't really tied to a specific ethnicity or even tied to Africa as such. They would also use the same term for people from southern India. But still, you see, it's more ambiguous than it became later on when also language and the view of the world became more racialized, or racialized in a different way, if you want. Yeah.
Yeah, because
So
yeah, go ahead.
that's more ambiguous in the early modern period, and even in the 18th century, it's still more ambiguous. So usually, Africa would be very dark-skinned, and America might be more brown-skinned. Sometimes both dark-skinned, and sometimes artists just exchanged these. And we can't say why. I mean, there's no written source and stuff like that. I think so. One thing is they obviously didn't care about these things so much. These were just representations of different parts of the world, and it was important that they were there, and not so much that as a skin color isn't this marker that it is in a colonial racialized society where you have plantation slavery everywhere and so on. And this colonial discourses, they later become re-exported to Europe in the late 18th century. And then in the 19th century. But at that time, this process is just beginning, and there are older traditions existing at the same time. So this makes it less clear. And it meant also that people and these artists didn't have such clear ideas. And I mean, for example, if you look at the Luther's translation of the Bible, then when he speaks of the rest of the world, he speaks of the Moorish lands, which just means, you know, those who are not Christians. But of course, they're not all dark-skinned people, or it's not just Africa or Ethiopia. So, yeah, there's lots of terms and concepts floating around, and they can be quite contradictory.
Do you
Yeah.
think, like, because I know the Dutch had a lot of New York and it was like New Netherlands and you had New Amsterdam with all of the interaction. Do you think a lot of any of those interactions kind of made it back, like any paintings, or it was just pretty much based on how you say, like a set way of how you should paint something and
Yeah,
books and stuff like that?
Well, don't know so much about the Dutch art history. I know a
Okay.
bit because of my current work. If you don't look at the four continents and this kind of fresco and sculpture, all these fixed decorations in public spaces or palatial spaces, then it's different. Of course, artists were, for example, painting portraits of servants brought over from the West Indies who were working in a noble household, or maybe a so-called court moor, which would be somebody employed by the nobility, probably enslaved or at least brought as an enslaved person to Europe. These people existed in Germany, and more of them existed in places like Amsterdam, of course, because you had all these merchants who had plantations in the West Indies or had their ships, were involved in slave trade and so on. And if you look at this sort of media, then of course you have individuals, and they are represented as they appeared, which usually meant that they didn't have a sort of national costume, but they were the clothing of servants, or they were kind of wearing fantasy clothing, what people considered part of a Moor, which usually was a turban or kind of fantasy uniforms.
When you said the turban, yeah, because we have, the Cherokee, they're like the Cherokee or the Muskogean nations. So any of those, a lot of them wore a lot of turbans also here. So it was almost like some of them are almost accurate, where, some of the stuff that they were wearing are portrayed in some of these paintings, like the bulb earrings. Like, I'll show you an example, because there's some stuff that was pulled out of a lot of the mounds that you'll see in a lot of these paintings, because there's multiple images around Europe of like indigenous Americans, and you can start to see how the image kind of changes after maybe 1803, we'll say, into the 1810, because they crossed the Mississippi Delta and they got into the West. So a lot of the images just completely change from that timeline. So when we see these images, they say, yeah, they've never seen an indigenous person before. So they're just doing these elaborate, they're kind of, they're not real. They're almost like, yeah, they're making up these things because this is what they think that they should, they look like. But when you go into a lot of the history and a lot of the books, literally, these are the projections, the portrayals and all that stuff, until America actually becomes U.S. Until the colonies actually become the United States of America, and a lot of the history starts to get kind of changed.
I'm still wondering why they really, why we didn't really find a single example where somebody broke out from this very narrow set of models. Because, from this, there are these famous paintings by John White, the watercolors from Virginia from the 16th century, where you get a very clear idea of how the indigenous people there looked. He's even providing names. And then these were turned into prints for the Heicklot series. And these were big additions that people had in their libraries all across Europe. But when they were when they wanted to paint these religious programs, for village churches or monastery churches, or also for palaces, when they were going into these allegorical directions, they were just not interested in this information. It's interesting. I think in itself, it tells us a lot of about how different these people in the 17th, 18th century viewed the world, and they didn't have this empirical mindset that's informing the way we look at the world. It was in many ways a different culture, even though I'm Austrian, but I'm living 300 years later. So this information about at least some indigenous ethnics, some indigenous cultures, and what they looked like, and what their religion was about, and so on, that existed, right? Of course, it was through a filter of European observers, but to the scholarly minded, to the educated, to the colonizers, this information, this empirical information was available. And this also entered into book illustrations and so on. But it didn't really enter into the village churches. Yeah.
When it comes to like the transatlantic slave trade and stuff like that, how is it like kind of taught over there? So like, because there is a issue where they were bringing a lot of indigenous from Americas to like Europe to Sierra Leone to like a lot of these places. Do you know any instance of like American Indians that were brought to like Austria or Germany that are documented, that were used as muses for these
Yeah.
paintings or something along those lines?
Well, actually, there were such cases. I think that most of them, at least as far as current research shows, and I mean, for a long time, this was a very neglected topic. It's also hard to research because the archival material is dispersed and so on. But I think, especially to Spain or the Iberian Peninsula, a lot of these people were brought. This has something to do with the Spanish colonial empire starting early and being very large, encompassing a lot of populous indigenous cultures. And so, I mean, in theory, they were not enslaved in the Spanish kingdoms because they were subjects of the king. But at least they were highly dependent, and theory and practice are kind of two different things. There were also, I know of instances where such people were brought to Britain, to the Netherlands. I know of two so-called Indian princes who were brought from South Carolina by an Indian trader who was kicked out of the colony. He brought two captives, two enslaved Indian warriors to Europe, and then he showed them through all the major cities. They also stopped in Vienna.
And what would the name of that guy be? What would the name of that?
I've forgotten the name. There's an
Oh,
excellent
okay.
article by Greg Kostlbauer, so I can send you that information.
Oh,
He
that'd be
has
awesome if you
researched
could.
that, yeah. And they were shown off as the tattooed Indian princes. And in the end, he sold them to the Prince Elector of Saxony, August, in Dresden, and they became kind of court servants, runners. So they would accompany the king when he was also king of Poland. So when he was moving around in public, the runners would precede him. And I think one of them sort of deserted later on, and the other died in the king's service. And I know of an Indian boy who was brought to the court of Brunswick. And I mean, if you look close enough, there are more cases. There are two men from Brazil who were brought in the early 19th century to Vienna, probably enslaved. I know that the Moravian Church brought at least one boy from Suriname, Arawak, and they also brought people from Suriname to Bethlehem in Pennsylvania to their communal church settlements there. So these became Moravians, but they entered as kind of, it's really, the status is hard to ascertain, but at least highly dependent people. Yeah. So people were traveling. There was this commerce going on also to East India. And this meant that indigenous people, usually as captives or enslaved people, ended up pretty much everywhere, I guess. It's hard to retrieve their traces.
Yeah.
And it's not huge numbers because this was expensive. So only the rich kind of did this. But yeah, you
that totally
also find
answered.
them in Europe. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that totally answered. Yeah, because I've always wondered, like, because when you look at the pictures, some of them, they portray some of the, like, what you would call Black American or
Yeah.
something like that from like the South or, up the coast area. Because I noticed, so it's like with these paintings, so you start having the camera. So, it's like, so once they started passing the Mississippi Delta, paintings were no longer used to kind of document history. So when they started going across into the West, they started to get different images. So when you try to compare today's images or from the 1800s to the paintings that were being painted between 1600s and the 1700s, totally different people. You have the Iroquois, you have the Algonquin, you have the Muskogean, the Arawak, and a lot of these nations lived east of the Mississippi Delta. A lot of them were the ones that were being subjected to the slavery. By the time they got across, slavery was still well and known, but you had other nations they came in contact with at the same time. What do you think when it came to, do you think those were just uh, they weren't real? Do you think they were just making up because they said,
Yeah.
it's a continent with people with dark skin? Do you think that it was just a big elaborate,
Yeah, I think I know where you're going with the question. If you see a trace of what was actually happening in the colonies with this shattering of people, this moving of people and cultures, were kind of removal of indigenous people and removal of African people kind
Yeah.
of intermingles and entangles. Is there a trace of that in these paintings in our database? Well, and the answer is no. These artists, they used skin color, what they considered as black or brown, as a marker of authority, and therefore they kind of were also sort of almost willy-nilly sometimes exchanging these colors, and making the America, the allegory of America, maybe even darker than the allegory of
Yeah, because I've
Africa.
seen some of that. Yeah.
Unfortunately, there's nothing you can read in that, because we
Yeah.
see that the actual model for these allegories is a very specific print, and that has been used like 30 times already. When you search in the database unter Vorlage as a model, then you can also see such prints. I can also send you the links. And yeah, and this is, and also the kind of, and they use the attributes like the lion or the alligator or the bow, or maybe a special bird, something like that, a parrot, just as these are signs or symbols of authority. And their view of the world is, okay, there are four parts of the world. One part is Europe, that's the Christian part. And of course, you have already a hierarchy there, even if they are maybe depicted on the same level. But this is the Christian part. And then you have the other three parts who also will be eventually, when Christ returns, they will be Christian too. So there's a strong eschatological or chiliastic idea there that doesn't really has to be expressed because it's so common for early modern Christians. So they understand this. Yeah. So, and also they think maybe that the end of the world might be much nearer because it's something that's in the Bible. So it's not something about the universe expanding or the sun getting cooler or whatever. They don't, of course, they don't have these ideas. Their world is infused. Religion is everywhere, and everything is legitimized and argued through religion. It's kind of woven into the tapestry of their life, so to say. And so they see it also in these frescoes, and it's present in these decorations and sculptures and so on. And then you have, next to Europe, there's Asia. And of course, Asia is powerful and it's very rich. They have silks, they have gold. They might even be they could even be superior to Europe as far as military power go. For a long time they were, because these Germans, they usually equate Asia with the Ottoman Empire. And of course, this was a big danger for a long time. For 2 times, they tried to conquer Vienna. So it was, this was a threat that from the 16th to the 17th century was very real to people in Germany, especially in the south. Because there were raids by Ottoman forces. These villages were plundered, people taken captive and taken away to the Ottoman Empire, and vice versa, of course. The Christians did the same. But this is a kind of So this is all present, or all of this can be present in how Asia is depicted. And it's also a heathen place, but it's also powerful, and in a way it's also civilized. And then sometimes you have this hierarchy where Africa and America, these are the two barbarian parts of the world.
Yeah.
And also sort of the younger parts of the world, which makes no sense to us today. But there are also kind of decorations where you see there's a program that America is almost like the child among the four continents, and Europe is the most senior one because it's Christian and so developed and so on. Yeah.
And you can
And
see that in the images too. You could
yeah,
kind of
and
see
because
that.
I think these are the two barbarian parts, sometimes they kind of exchange the symbols and exchange experiences, and they are almost indistinguishable. Yeah, because that's the message that the artist wants to transfer, a message of barbarism, and that's what he does. And again, it's about these very rather simple stereotypical messages. People have to understand it just by looking at it. They don't need, there shouldn't be somebody having to explain it to them. Yeah, that's why this isn't really, there's no information about how people in the colonies look, or beyond the colonies.
Yeah.
Sorry, that kind of gets into these visual decorations. It's different if you look at book publications and so on at the time. There you have travel reports and illustrations that try to be more faithful. But before of that, so I think you're touching on an important point. I'm often wondering how much of, you have in the 18th century, in the colonies and the frontier regions, you have 2 centuries of trade and cultural exchange going on. And we know that the colonists adopt parts of native cultures, dress, so the way they waged war, the deerskin coats and stuff like that. Yeah. And they also use this as a symbol for themselves to define themselves as Americans, right? Against the British, for example, we are the American colonists, and then suddenly they dress up as Mohawks, which is an absurdity, but it made sense for them. It makes sense because this is a culture, these European cultures are used to communicate through symbols, through seriality, through kind of visual codes. And that's why they use it all the time. When we do it too, but our visual codes work different, right? And I wonder, through all that trading and exchange, how much of this European symbols of alterity of the Moorish land, like the turban, this kind of pseudo Oriental costume, which isn't actually Turkish or anything, right? How much of that got into indigenous cultures as trade goods, because they are offering them turbans, they are offering them certain type of things like, I think, pipe tomahawks produced in England or France.
Yeah, because
doesn't make any
those,
sense, right?
Yeah.
Either you want a good axe or you want the pipe, but probably not smart to combine it. So these European ideas of what these people might need or want, because they have these strong biases. Maybe the Muskogee look a bit like they looked in the early 19th century because of European trade, because of exchange of images. And I don't know, in ethnohistory, there is this concept of creative misunderstandings. Maybe this is one of these creative misunderstandings. Of course, the Muskogee use goods different than Europeans may have intended, and incorporate into their own culture. It's a process of hybridization, as the Europeans do, but still they come with these Europeans come with these preconceived ideas when they interact with indigenous people everywhere. And they have an idea of what they should look like and what they should do, even if they don't, if it's an illusion, of course, yes.
Yeah, because I figure they've had so much, because over it's like almost two, like you said, 2 centuries of
Yeah.
contact, so it's like for like you got a lot of scholars here that will say, well, they don't know what they're talking, they've never seen it. It's like we had almost over 200 years of contact. So it's like, how does are they not portraying the people who are they're in contact with, and it's
Yeah.
like, I understand some of the garb might be overly done, crowns, you have like certain things that you really wouldn't see there, it's like, but there's like a lot of the artifacts, like you'll see like can I get into some of the PDF, if that's cool?
Yeah.
Do you
Sure.
mind, just so we can get in, just
I mean, if you, for example, take these two Indian princes, the so-called Indian princes that stopped in Vienna, there are also depictions of them, kind of like broadsheets, where you see a picture of their tattoos. And they're wearing European clothing. You can see that, and they have opened their shirts, and you see the beautiful warrior tattoos. And there, of course, the intention of the artist was authenticity. But authenticity is not what motivates these visual iconography of the 4 continents. Andex, yes.
You can see the screenshot, all right, correctly,
Yeah,
right?
I
Okay.
see it.
So yeah, I'll just jump to some of the images so we're not really like going too deep into them. So yeah, like stuff like this. So like when I'm looking at these, because you'll see like, he's wearing a turban with a crown. Some of them will be elaborate, but it's almost like, they'll call the American colored races. So I assume, you got 3 different colors, Americans here, but then you got your the African where they're project total different color.
Yeah.
So it's like when you look at these images, they're making an effort to kind of separate the two, per image.
If you look at the figure in the background with the arrows on the back and the feather crown, I mean, this looks like it's directly taken out of this Froschauer print from 1505.
Okay.
So this is this age-old iconography. And then this person kneeling before that figure, which has a bare head, so there's not really hot. It's just a blue textile coat or whatever.
Yeah.
And you see an armband or something like that. So this is these are just very loose marks of, this is a person from a barbarian place. Yeah. Of course, nakedness is maybe the prime sign of Africa and America. They are the naked places. That's the
And
sign of
there's,
barbarians. The civilized people like
yeah.
Asians and Europeans,
Yeah.
they wear clothing, right?
And one thing I do notice too is like the whole red, white, and blue that they use a lot before the flag was even the US flag. So that one really confused me. I'm not sure if they're just using a great color scheme or it was just all coincidence, because when you start to see a lot of photos, there's also one where he's wearing like a gown and he has like white stripes on his gown and his shirt's all blue. And this was like, it was done before the American flag became the American flag. So it was like
Yeah, no, I think this has nothing to do with the Star
yeah.
Spangled Banner.
That's what
No,
I was like, because I'm like, the colors are just almost like there's like, because they'll do a lot of the red, white, and blue, but I just assume it's going to be like, those are good colors together,
Yeah. As I said, it just ties in with the whole color scheme of these frescoes. I mean, this is interesting because you have here references to you see these huge bundles, which the merchants used at that time. So this would be the bundles that were brought aboard ship and then unloaded and European harbors. So this is also a reference to the riches of these continents. And this is something you don't get that often. So this would be kind of a secular, not a religious reference. But again, it's in a religious context. So all these 4 continents showing their riches or giving them to
gifts and...
when everything I don't know what I've forgotten what the central motive in Andex is. But anyway, whether it is the adoration of the Eucharist or the adoration of Christ or the Virgin Mary, it's always kind of, we are all subject to you now. So we are all united in one faith, and we are welcoming the Savior or whatever. Even when there is a secular context in these programs, it's ultimately religious. Of course, it's different in a merchant place like the Palais Leb in Vienna. This was a small palace built by a rich merchant, and there the topic is really the riches that mercantile enterprise bring. And there they use the 4 allegories, the allegories of the 4 continents, just to signify this. From all parts of the world, the riches come to me, who was rich enough to build this place, more or less.
And then, so like, even with the statues, like, let me just jump into one real quick. So where is it? It is like, so here, let me go to the one that I really want to touch on. Should I already have the numbers kind of, oh, here we go. So this one right here was one I really wanted to touch on because, it's using the symbol as like, that has always kind of been that symbol that they've used, that they've portrayed in movies.
This popular image of the stoic Indian,
Yeah.
That's, I guess still exists today in a way in pop culture. I don't think it existed at the time. Can you just help me which church that is? Because there are many
this one is
similar examples.
This one was the
Regensburg.
Okay. And then the date of this one was 1751 to 1757. I think it was Simon's sword. Because those references didn't really come into pop culture to the 1800s, because it was
that's really
through film.
That's created later, and I wouldn't say this is just a coincidence. I mean, I'm sure it wasn't intended to express stoicism, especially if you have these photos which are always sort of playful, It's this kind of almost babies that are playing at being the 4 continents. It would be interesting to find more references of crossed arms. So it could be that this is a heathen continent who is just now maybe refusing Christianity and is just now in the process of giving up his resistance. That might be an explanation that comes to mind, but it's just an idea. So, but the idea of the Stoic Indian, I've never encountered that in any contemporary writing. And in my current project, working on the Moravian Church, I'm reading a lot of German literature of that time. It's Protestant literature, but nevertheless, people who actually lived in Pennsylvania and New York and did missions among the Delaware and so on, and Shawnee, Shamokin, and so on. They really knew the backcountry, these Moravian missionaries. But this isn't one of the big. This isn't one of the prevalent stereotypes Germans would have when they encountered Native Americans. And of course, the artists who created the sculptures didn't encounter indigenous people in North America. Maybe they would encounter one at the court somewhere in Germany, but then this person, they probably wouldn't even know that it's a Native American because it would be lacking all the symbols. So,
and he would dressed in like European clothing.
I mean, an example that I really love is I I've forgotten the details, but it's an Englishman who brings, I think, Inuit from Labrador to the British court in the early 18th century. And he wants to introduce, or he's asked to introduce these Inuit to the British Queen. And he doesn't have, they don't have their costumes, their sealskin stuff. So they have just, he gave them European clothing. So, and he said, well, you can't go to court in that clothing. And then he has a tailor make Oriental costumes, Moorish costumes, to present them as these strange people to the English Queen. But these are people from Labrador,
And then go ahead, keep continuing.
And even to this guy, it was sort of logical. I'm presenting heathens to the Queen, so I have to give them something. I have to clothe them fitting for the court setting. So he chooses this kind of Oriental costume.
And then
it's so strong in European culture. It's strange, yeah.
And then when you say Moor, can we just break, because I know there's a lot of people who understand Moor as like the Moroccan Empire, but then there's also the Moor as like it was being referenced to people of skin color, like of darker skin at one point, and it was kind of used as a broad umbrella. Do you think you can kind of just explain that just a little bit, just so like people aren't confused when that?
Yeah, it's confusing, and actually been doing research on that, on the historical semantics. I mean, German up well into the 18th century, they used the term Moor, which is Moor in English, referring to people they consider dark-skinned, or black. Sometimes black and the black and the Moor is used interchangeably. But this also can contain a reference to Islam, so Muslim people. So they could also designate subjects of the Ottoman Empire as Moors. But these people are very often from the Balkans or from Greece. By any stretch of the imagination, dark skin. So you see this kind of sort of diffuse. It's not common to use them that way, but it still happens, and probably people understood it because they're used to understand these terminology in context, in a specific context. And sometimes it's also used to kind of describe the function of this prestigious foreign servant. So this could also be the court Moor, could also be somebody who's been enslaved somewhere in Inner Asia, or someone from the Black Sea region. But it was also a slave trade into Europe. So and the Germans, when if you're looking at the Moravians I'm working on, they for a very long time they continue to designate people as Moors. So we're going to the Moors, we're visiting the Moors, even when they are on St. Thomas, what's today the US Virgin Islands, and the plantations there, and they kind of want to missionize the enslaved population. And then they start to use the N-word or the blacks as kind of the technical term the Dutch and the Danish use, in the colony. And then they start to bring that back to Germany, but it's usually used as a synonym for enslaved people. They almost never use the term slave, Sklave. They always use the N-word because it's synonymous in the West Indies.
Yeah, because you have a lot of people who are arguing, and some people be like, yeah, no, the Moors are this. And it's like, yeah, no, well, the Moors are, and it's like, no, well, we are Moors. And it's like, yes, but the Moors was just an umbrella. I try to kind of dig that in, that Moor was just an umbrella term.
It's an umbrella term, exactly, yeah.
Almost like black, it's like, because you got Africans, they can be considered black. You got Black Americans considered black, and it's like, but that umbrella term kind of just, almost like white and black, and it's like, so yeah, that one.
Just to add to that, in the 18th century, people brought from the Malabar coast of India, also East India, brought to Europe via the VOC or the British Eastern colonies and so on. These are universally referred to as Moors or Mohren in Germany at the time. That's really just because of their dark skin color. And then confusingly, when they are in Tranquebar in southern India, they say, oh, well, there are two sorts of people living here. The one are the Moors, and then they mean the Muslims living there, and there are the Hindus,
Okay.
and suddenly, in Germany, the same people, the same person would be referred to as a Moor, that's maybe referred to as a Hindu when they are in the area, in the colonial area. So it's just an Outrankebar, it's just a Danish outpost. It's colony is almost a too big word. But yeah, it changes constantly. These terms are really hard to grasp. They change
Yeah.
context, right? But it's stepping back a bit and say, trying to give a general definition, then it's best to say it's an umbrella term that rests mainly on skin color, but it could also be a lot of some other aspects.
Yeah, because it could also be Muslim too, or it could be
Yeah,
because there's also in the green vault that is called the Emerald Cluster, the Moorish Emerald Cluster. But then they go
yeah,
into details. It's a projection of a chief in Florida, but they call it the Moorish Cluster. So when people
yeah,
hear that, they just assume like, oh, he's an African Moor, from here and here. It's like now it's kind of like where people do try to say like, they're Muslim, they're not black, and it's like weird
yeah,
how these
yeah.
terms start to have all these different meanings. And so
And
like,
then it
yeah,
changes in the 19th century or even in the late 18th century. So I always say kind of the German language gets colonized by colonial discourse or colonial terminologies. And then people still use the word more. They use it into the 20th century, Germans, but it becomes synonymous with the German N word, so Neger, and it really takes on the same meaning, and it becomes racialized. So all
okay.
these very clear derogatory understandings are just there, because now you have this kind of pseudo-scientific hierarchy of human races and so on. And that's then also, so it makes a lot of difference if you read the term in a 19th century or 20th century text and you read it in an 18th or 17th century text. So people would understand it very different and mean different things and have different associations.
Yeah, totally agree. So I just want to jump into this one real quick. Let's go right here. So because this right here, so there's a map. This is when the Dutch were in Amsterdam. After it was taken, they were doing say a survey on New York, right? This was 1740. They found the burial ground, and it has over 20,000 bodies in it. Right now, it's buried
Yeah.
under the City Hall building, like within the area of New York. It was opened about 3 times between 1740 to 1991. When the first time it was opened, it was robbed. A lot of the artifacts were taken. They were kind of, they were grave robbed. The second one was more of yeah, well, I'm just gonna shoot password. So in 1991, they used it for the Human Genome Project. So what they wanted to do was they
Oh,
wanted
wow.
to categorize some of the DNA from a lot of these graves to try to categorize the human genome. Some of the stuff that they found in it that were really interesting was like a lot of these those little kind of drop earrings that are portrayed in most of the paintings. And they found some of these. I only grabbed a couple of. So these were found in the burial ground. And then you start to find the armbands. So here's a lot of the armbands that were found. So this one was found in the burial ground, and these ones were found in other mounds across Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina. And I just got a couple examples, but you can kind of go into, there's
Oh,
many.
fascinating. Yeah.
So with this graveyard particularly, they found 20,000 bodies there. They took about 40, I think it was like 45 bodies, and they tested them for the Human Genome Project. Ancestry.com already did a documentary on about it, that this is the single source for most Black Americans when they get their DNA test.
Oh,
So when I seen this, and then you start to see the artifacts, it kind of like, these are the artifacts that were in the burial ground, and these are kind of the artifacts that they're kind of portraying in some of the paintings. And we already have an understanding that these are Black Americans. They have kind of designated as this is an African American burial ground. They're African, that were brought over as slaves and stuff like that. And you'll start to find, they were dressed in beads, they were dressed in different things, but they'll say that they're Nigerian beads. There's pipes that they were trading with like the Dutch and English. They're saying these pipes are pretty much just saying none of this stuff is real. But when I came into these paintings, it was kind of interesting because I've seen these like of these armbands and these earrings and all that stuff before. But when I started actually seeing the paintings, you start to see the armbands, you start to see the earrings, and it was kind of like very fascinating. This is not really a question. I just wanted to kind of just show, that like there are little pieces of artifacts that are kind of there that were being projected in some of these paintings that were almost on point. That's all I just wanted to kind of like just kind of touch on because that burial ground is today it's called the African Burial Ground in New York City, and it's like majority of that is an Algonquin burial ground. What they started to do was they started to call them Negro burial grounds so they can preserve the history. So what they do is they designate them as historical Negro slave burial grounds, and then they go in and they start undigging, taking up all the artifacts. They take the bones, they put them in museums. So it's like we do have like maybe artifacts or stuff that we can kind of point to, but like yeah, I just wanted to kind of touch on that because that was kind of like wow, okay. I see a lot of the bulb earrings, and then when I seen the stuff that they're pulling out of the graveyard was almost similar to some of the stuff that was being portrayed in these paintings. So yeah, because I know like in Manhattan, the Dutch they had a lot of community contact, thinking maybe they would have brought some of those things that they've portrayed with back into some of their paintings. Do you think that might have been the case?
Well, I mean, this is really fascinating. Thank you for bringing this to
Yeah.
my attention.
I will send you the actual
Uh,
information so you can go through all the because they have it categorized, all the stuff they found, all the bodies.
I
So
really would like to read the research results of that dig. Yeah, I mean these pearl drop earrings, these are really common so in the Baroque era. So they were kind of ubiquitous. I mean the nobility would have real pearls, but it's a very common form. I mean you can even get them today if you're lucky in an auction or something like that.
yeah.
If you really have a kind of African burial ground where people, probably enslaved people or formerly enslaved people, would be buried in a place like in an old colonial town like New York, then I would assume that this is kind of the kind of jewelry that these enslaved people who probably worked as laborers and servants or whatever, sometimes as artisans, often as artisans in shipbuilding and so on, but they would acquire, would be given. I mean, I know that kind of Moorish servants at courts in Germany, they would also get this sort of costumes, at least for official functions, not all the time. But if there was kind of a procession or, the nobility going to church on a feast day and all the servants accompanying them, then the Moor would come in his turban and with the feathers and the silver armbands, sometimes even a silver collar signifying enslavement, probably. So I wonder if maybe some of the artifacts here have the same background. So this is the colonizers or the enslavers making their enslaved servants conforming to optically or visually to the
Okay.
ideas they have. Yeah.
Yeah, because it was really strange because
But
like oh
yeah,
go ahead.
really, I mean, this would be just an idea, an hypothesis. I mean, it might be as well that this is actual African or Native American uh, objects that people used or continue to use, or sometimes reproduced in America. Or maybe they could take them along on the Middle Passage because it was on their bodies. I really don't know. This would be just a
Yeah.
guess, but it's a
Yeah, this
fascinating
is just
topic,
speculation.
and that um, and I'm really now getting interested in the possible repercussions when we have these kind of European stereotypical ideas about the four continents and what people should sort of look like. Except that we know that the scholars, the educated people could have different ideas because they could look up illustrations and encyclopedias and so on, where they might have more faithful representations. But if we're staying in this kind of in the sphere of allegories, in the sphere of cosmological messages and so on, and also that's also not only prevalent in the allegories of the four continents, but also in the whole courtly culture of representation. This is always about authority. It's not about specific indigenous nations. I wonder how much that's influenced also how Europeans going to the colonies kind of clothe their servants, what they tried to sell or give to indigenous people, how much they tried to change these people and cultures they encountered according to the ideas or the images they already had in their heads, and how much we probably see this in such objects. Could be that I'm totally wrong. So this is like
It's all
formulating first.
speculation,
Yeah,
we're all
first question.
speculating.
I
So
think this is really fascinating, and it's really kind of inspiring.
yeah, because this pretty much is all speculation. We're having just microphone. You can hear me all right, right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah,
I
it's
heard
like
you all
so.
right.
It's like, yeah, because that's why I want to get you on, and have the kind of conversation, because we are just sitting here speculating. Nobody really knows why they made the paintings, why they are portrayed the certain ways that they are. But it makes for great conversation,
Yeah.
100%, and it helps. A lot of us that have been kind of denied a lot of our ancestry or our history, it kind of opens up a little bit more of a conversation when we do try to assert it, and
Yeah.
we don't have, because a lot of the history, it's written in books, it's written in, and people don't really read books these days, and it's like people would rather look at a picture than a painting, so
Yeah.
it's like it's kind of hard to kind of put the history together, because all of it is kind of like in books and in paintings and stuff. So, you can't really take paintings, for face value, because it's just paintings.
I think what interested us in this about this village church phenomenon, because these fixed paintings that are fixed on the walls, these are outside of the palaces of the nobility. They are outside of books that only rich people, educated people could afford. These were images that peasants could see every day if they wanted, at least every Sunday. And this kind of really, because there were so many village churches where we encountered these things, this is really something that must have, in a way, informed the way German, or reinforced the way German peasants in these regions thought about the world and the four parts of the world. So we see from this, we can, with some, so I think we can deduce that they didn't have a very clearly formed idea about America and Africa. It was faraway places, it were heathen places where maybe cannibalism was practiced. It was kind of the barbarian places. And thinking about world history, sooner or later we would all be together, united in this one Christian faith. So this is not much, one might say, but on the other hand, I think we don't know that much about Central European populations in the early modern period, and how they perceived America, and at least we have some idea. And I mean, in the end, these people, or some of these people, and their children or grandchildren, ended up in colonial ventures, either in the West Indies or the East Indies. So this is also illustrative of the stereotypes that existed, and the biases that existed in European minds, not only in Germany. Yeah.
And then just another example, because I noticed, like, you'll notice in some of them, you'll see like some of the Africans are portrayed as European. Would that be like the portrayal of South Africans, like a lot of the was it the Dutch that went to South Africa? Because I noticed some of the paintings, like when you go to them, you'll see America will be portrayed as black, Africa, and like the other side is like portrayed as white. Like I have another example. So if we go to this example right here, so you have no, so this wouldn't have been the one. I think I forgot the one. But if I went back to that other image, you see examples where you'll see like a lot of like you'll see some of the portrayals will be some of the Europeans being portrayed as African, and I'm just gonna assume like because a lot of the was it the Dutch? I can't remember. That went into South Africa around
Yeah.
1650 or something.
Yeah, I mean the Dutch went
Okay.
to the Cape and established the Cape Colony there, and there were also they practiced enslavement there. They brought people from East Africa and from India, actually from all over the Indian Ocean area. They
Okay.
all
Yeah,
ended up in Cape Town. So yeah, and I mean there's some well-known and famous images of the so-called Hottentots, which would be the kind of original population there. It's actually two people or two languages. I'm forgotten. So, but no, again, I think these artists were not interested in Dutch colonies or anything of that. They said, okay, we have three portraits, three
go back to the one.
monarchs representing the four colonies, and they wouldn't go to any Dutch imprints and trying to really bring something from use something depicting someone from the Cape Colony. They would search to their huge book of models and look for
Okay.
something that fits the bill. Yeah.
Okay, because like here's an example right here. So you have the American on
Yeah,
the
on the alligator,
yeah,
beautiful. Yeah.
and then you have like it's like they're portraying because people are like shocked, like what do you mean? And it's like
Yeah, I mean
because they
that's really
yeah
that's to us it's weird that suddenly Africa is white, but this is not because there are colonies, and we're at that time a very small colony
yeah
of Europeans at the Cape. But I mean, people could identify it because there's the lion. I mean, it's the four continents. That's pretty clear. And so the one with the lion is Africa. It's a bit weird. It's not typical, but I wouldn't relate it to knowledge
yeah
about
no that's why
any
someone
Dutch
asked me to
ventures.
ask that. Someone was like, can you
Yeah, it's
ask him
logical.
why?
Yeah,
I was just like
if you're
I'm
not
just gonna
familiar
assume.
with how this whole industry and this whole this building industry and this painting industry worked, and how these visual programs of this post-Tridentinian era in the 17th and 18th century, how that worked, then of course you ask such questions. To us, this is pretty foreign. Yeah.
Yeah, a good friend from Nigeria, when we were going, I was showing him the book and he's going through, he's like, why are they white? He's like, why? I'm
Yeah.
just like, we can't explain, we kind of have to like,
Yeah.
and I'm like, that's why I want to interview. Maybe he might have an answer, but it's all speculation at
Yeah.
this time. None of us were born in those days, so we can just kind of go through the history and kind of speculate on our idea and what we might think,
But again, it shows that the artist wasn't interested in authenticity because it wouldn't have been that hard to. I mean, he could have used in his book of models or in his collection of prints he used as models. He would have depictions of Moors, I guess. So he could have easily used those, but he decided against it for whatever reason. But still, to everybody, to all onlookers, it must have been clear that this was Africa. So there's the figure with the alligator, there's the figure with the lion, obvious. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's funny because sometimes some of them aren't because you will see like some of them with the line, like you'll see America sometimes like, with the line. So that one always would confuse me. I'm like, was there lions in America or are they just using
No.
symbology? Because
Yeah,
I know
they're
we got
just.
mountain lions, but not like maned lions, It's like,
Yeah, I was also thinking maybe of mountain lions or something like that. Yeah, but bobcats. But
yeah,
I don't
cougar
think
or
that they
yeah.
would suddenly, for just for the single attributes, the animal, that they would go to such lengths as they would checking out if there's a book that tells them what animals to encounter in America. So it's just a wild place. So they would exchange the alligator for the crocodile. They would probably speak of crocodiles. They would exchange the crocodile for a lion. So yeah.
Yeah, because you do see the crocodile a lot, and it's almost like it's pretty much, and then you'll see the parrot. So it's
Yeah.
almost like they're using the animals, but then sometimes just randomly you'll see the lion, and then there's just one. This will pretty much be the last one, and then we can kind
Yeah,
of
I think we should wrap it up. So
yeah, I just
take
want to
pity on the people watching this.
just with the one, just kind of example of the lion. You know what? I might have lost it. Oh, here we go. So like here's an example of one right here. So like so where's the line? So right here. So you have like the lion on the American side, but then you
Yeah.
also have the crocodile.
This is a great painting because such a lot of things going. There's really a lot of action, a lot of things are going on, and one feels like the crocodile is kind of climbing out of the frame of the picture. So yeah, but what we see is that again you have this very clearly barbarian continents, always
Yeah.
from 18th century German perspective, of course, and the wild animals that belong to them. And even here we see how this is kind of interchangeable. The animals are next to each other, almost interacting. Maybe the crocodile will start to bite the lion in the next second,
Yeah. Go
and
over.
it's almost fleeing. Yeah. So yeah, I think this is all about the action of the moment that's depicting
Okay.
here. That it's dramatic. It's not that important to give the right animal to the right allegory.
Okay. Yeah, no, I appreciate you taking the time, to come in and like answer some of the questions and stuff. And I'm glad we were able to make an understanding from the previous from Marion, and the copyright thing with all that. We always make sure that we always ask for permission from now on. Now that we know exactly who we need to
Yeah,
contact
yeah,
and
yeah,
stuff
yeah.
like that. And
Yeah, but
like
also if you have questions, please feel free to get back in touch with me or Marion or Wolfgang. So all three of us are kind of interested in yeah, it's nice when somebody's interested and provides a totally new angle and yeah, comes from another direction. Yeah, not necessarily out of the scholarly community or this community of historians, but yeah, has a personal interest. This is yeah.
Yeah, because these images, they're kind of like very, it's like when they went out into the space, you see them like people will like kind of like, hey, they'll post little posts like, hey, you see this, and they'll post. So now every time I see them now, I try to point them towards the actual website now. So when
Yeah,
I start seeing them, say, hey, if you want to actually see the actual photos, you can go to the website, support the website. We posted the link for the books that were being sold on Amazon and all that. And there was a
yeah.
few that right after we posted the link, whoosh, they were gone. So I'm like, I
Okay.
think someone jumped in and bought them real quick. So I think there are more books. So I've been kind of like
Yeah, I mean
directing
we
people
have
towards those.
one English language publication, and I'm really happy we have them. There's also a Japanese angle in there, Japanese Jesuit theater, and Italian and Polish as examples are also treated as well. So I mean, this should be quite accessible to everybody interested in Canada or the US. And as I
Yeah.
said, as Marion would be willing to send the few remaining examples to whoever is interested. Or when you can distribute the books however you see fit.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you taking the time.
A pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
And thank you for being a part of it. And hopefully, when I watch it back, I'm not stuttering too much, and stuff like that. And hopefully, I was able to get kind of my questions across a little bit, and
It was very stimulating. Thank you. Yeah.
Awesome. And thank
So
you very much. I
we'll
really
stay in
appreciate
touch.
it.
Thank you.